we've had a lot of discussion over the last couple of years about the minimum wage. That's a very important conversation to have about raising the minimum wage in this country, which has not been raised for quite a while. But there are also a number of workers in this country who don't even make minimum wage, who are paid what's called the sub-minimum wage, tipped workers, and so on. Here to talk to us about that now is Ben Spielberg. Ben is a research associate at the Federal Fiscal Policy Division of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and he is also the manager of the Full Employment Project there. He's a co-host of a podcast on the economy with the economist Jared Bernstein, and he has recently written about this subject of sub-minimum wage workers at the American Prospect. He joins us now. Ben, I'm so glad I got through that introduction, and thanks for coming on the Zero Hour.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Richard. I'm really excited to be here.
And I'm excited to talk about this topic because I think it's really important. So tell us a little bit about what you had to say in this article. Rather than me summarize it, why don't you just briefly go through your main points there, if you would, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I tried to focus on is I think a lot of the discussion around the new bill that Democrats just introduced, the Raise the Wage Act of 2017, which would raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2024, is going to focus on that headline rate of $15 an hour that the majority of workers who will benefit will see. But I wanted to write something about some of the components of that bill that I think are very important and should not get lost in the discussion of it. And that is the fact that the bill phases out sub-minimum wages, as you mentioned, for other workers in the country who right now are exempt from the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. So there are really three categories of workers who are covered by these sub-minimum wages. The largest is tipped workers. So these are workers primarily in the restaurant industry, but also could be hairdressers, could be taxi drivers, people who it's expected are going to get tips. And the federal minimum wage for those workers right now is only $2.13 an hour. The idea is that if you add in their tips at the end of the week, they're supposed to make up the difference between $2.13 an hour and the federal minimum of $7.25, but that rarely happens in practice. So there are over 4 million workers who are tipped in this country, and this bill over time would make the tipped minimum wage equivalent to the federal minimum wage. The other two categories of workers that right now are covered under sub-minimum wages are workers with disabilities. So right now, if you're an employer who wants to hire a worker with disabilities, you can apply for a certificate where you would be able to pay that worker less than the federal minimum wage based on what you think the productivity of that worker is compared to other workers who don't have disabilities. And so we think that that's a really big problem and should be phased out as well. So this bill would do that. And the third sub-minimum wage is one that a lot of people don't know exists and is actually rarely used, fortunately, but it's for teenagers. And if you're a teenager right now, the first 90 calendar days of your employment, an employer can pay you $4.25 an hour, after which they would raise your wage. But that would end also if this bill were to pass. So what I tried to argue in the piece is that not only would getting rid of those sub-minimum wages really help the workers in all three of those categories, but I think it also sends the message that the minimum wage is really an ethical standard and avoids giving credence to some of the arguments from minimum wage opponents, which allowed these sub-minimum wages to exist in the first place. And these arguments really don't have much basis. So I think it's a really big advance that this bill proposes to get rid of the sub-minimums.
Well, I think it is too, and I think it's very important, as you say, from an ethical point of view, to establish that everyone who works should be able to survive, should be able to earn a living wage. But let's talk about some of those counter arguments for a second, because a lot of people in the broader American community, I would characterize as people of goodwill, have questions. They're going to say, for example, let's talk about the family restaurant. Can that family restaurant really afford to pay the waiters and wait staff and cashiers and so on? Well, I guess cashiers aren't tipped, but can they really afford to pay the wait staff, let's say $15 an hour? What would be your response to that?
So I would say a couple things. The first I would note is that there are a lot of businesses that are very big proponents of this minimum wage increase and raising the minimum wage in general. There's a coalition called Business for a Fair Minimum Wage, which has been helping to push these increases around the country. So I think that there are certainly some businesses that are opposed to this, but there are a lot of businesses and small businesses, foremost among them, who are really in favor of these increases. The second thing that I would say is that the economic theory on the minimum wage is actually ambiguous on what the employment impacts of the minimum wage would be. I think the standard economic model, which a lot of opponents of the minimum wage rely on, says basically when labor costs go up, because that's going to be an increased cost on businesses, that's going to be difficult for them to deal with and handle. But that ignores that there are a lot of adjustment mechanisms that can happen when labor costs increase, some of which could actually be expected to increase employment and improve the state of the business and the economy. So one thing, for example, is productivity increases. There's a lot of churn in the low-wage labor market. So workers are kind of in and out of jobs. And the idea is if you pay workers a wage that's more commensurate with their value and give them a living wage, then workers will have increased productivity, and businesses will also be searching for efficiency gains that they might not have been looking for in the past, and so they might actually become more productive. There could be small price increases that come along with the minimum wage increase, and then there can also be a redistribution of profits and wealth within a company from really more highly paid workers and executives to the workers who would make the new minimum wage. And the last thing I think that's really important is that workers making the minimum wage are consumers as well. And so a lot of businesses support this increase because they note that if you give low-wage workers more money, they're going to go out and spend that in the economy, and that can have really positive effects too in creating demand for the goods and services that the business is providing.
And of all the points you made, and again, we're talking with Ben Spielberg of the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities about the sub-minimum wage, or eliminating the sub-minimum wage, which is a Democratic proposal now. I want to highlight a couple of them. One is the studies that have shown that, and for example, a minimum wage of $15 would have a marginal effect on the cost of a burger or whatever, that it might be, I've seen 17 cents or 37 cents or whatever, low numbers involved, so there might be a pricing adjustment. And secondly, and I think that it is important to think at a slightly more macro level, that if people are lower income working people in particular are getting more money, they're far more likely to spend it than wealthier people, and they're far more likely to spend it in community businesses. I mean, I think that's a fair statement, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's completely right. And you mentioned the research, and I think that the minimum wage itself has been one of the most studied issues over the past 25 years. The sub-minimum wages have been studied a little bit less, but what we've seen in the research is that minimum wage increases that have been pursued historically in the United States have never had the impacts that opponents of the minimum wage say that they will. This increase does push a little bit beyond the United States historical experience. So the research can't directly speak to that, but I think it's telling that all the research we've had so far has been very different from what opponents of the minimum wage would think.
This seems to be one of those cases, you work in economics, so you know how this goes, where when theory is on your side, and I'm thinking of opponents of minimum wage increases, but the data are not, embrace the theory and ignore the data.
Yeah, no, I think that does happen a lot, unfortunately. I do think that you have seen a shift in the mainstream economics community. And you mentioned Jared and my podcast. We had an episode on the minimum wage when this bill was first introduced. And Jared talked about how he's seen over the last 25 years or so since Alan Kruger and David Card published a book in the 90s where they really looked at a granular level at how the minimum wage affected employment. A lot of the economics community, I think, recognizes now that if you look at the empirical evidence on minimum wage increases, the benefits far outweigh any costs that do exist if there are costs, especially in the range of, again, historical increases that we've had.
Yeah, and bringing it back, and maybe to close by cycling back to the ethical question that you mentioned in your opening comments, which I think is so important. If we don't do something about the sub-minimum wage, I think ethically, I feel, but I want your reactions. I feel we're doing two things. One is we're saying that certain categories of workers, disabled workers, for example, are worth less, which I think for the same work, which I think is a moral principle to be seriously challenged and questioned. And I think if given the data that shows that tipped workers do not, in fact, by and large, achieve the minimum wage when you factor in their tips, and there's wage theft against tip workers and so on, that you really, in the case of tip workers, you're saying it's okay to not even pay them this grossly inadequate minimum wage we have today, but to pay them something far less than that. I think in both cases, we're up against a moral question, which is, do we believe as a nation that some workers are worth more than others, or that people should be paid what's less than a subsistence wage just because there's a loophole that allows employers to do it? What do you think of those observations?
No, I think that's 100% right. I mean, I think that, again, this is a baseline ethical standard where we say what kind of business is acceptable in this country, and we don't need to accept an economy in which certain workers are paid substandard wages, or we suggest that workers with disabilities don't have the same value as other workers. I think we definitely have an economy in which we can demand that employers treat their employees fairly. And there, again, are a lot of businesses who I think are very excited to be doing that already, and to be kind of at the forefront of the charge of trying to say, this is how the economy should operate for everybody.
Well, I think that's a great note on which to conclude this conversation. So unfortunately, we will have to leave it there, but Ben Spielberg of the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, thanks so much for writing about the issue of the sub-minimum wage, and thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thank you so much again for having me.
Absolutely.